Speaking of venture capital group chats, today's November 6th, 2024. Donald Trump has just been announced the presidential winner. What are the group chats like this morning in the VC space?
Not as active as I would have thought. Obviously, government has some impact. In reality, great companies are going to be formed under Democrats and Republicans. Great companies are going to be formed under, all sorts of government regimes. The thing that surprised me was there wasn't more conversation about Elon Musk. So we have somebody who's a top one or top one character in American tech right now get so involved in a political election in which it would seem to me that he has pretty good upside associated with having backed the winner. Yeah. SpaceX, Tesla. I think one of the most interesting tweets I saw was somebody tweeted that Biden not inviting Elon to the 2021 electric vehicle summit was one of the great unforced errors in American policy history. And, my hope for the new administration, or I guess the new old administration, is that this can be an era in which technology is very much seen as the solution to problems, where I think for a lot of the last 4 or 8 or 12 years, technology in the U.S. has been seen as the problem.
Yeah.
And certainly the large platform companies haven't done themselves any favors at all with respect to social media and all of the above. But, the United States has some real challenges right now globally.
Yeah.
And technology companies, I think, can be an unbelievable factor in solving those. And so my hope is that having America's, top technologists be so close with the president can hopefully have downstream impacts for energy and for sort of supply chain independence and a lot of other things that I think are really important right now.
We saw the S&P up how much this morning?
It was about 100 points this morning.
100 points. So I would think that most of venture capital leans left, at least outwardly. Do you think that venture capitalists, despite what they may have voted for in this election, do you think that they're maybe secretly happy this morning that Trump won?
Yeah, I think there's a nuance. Forgetting what venture capitalists think politically about their own beliefs, one of the things that I think not enough people have realized is that that mergers or acquisitions have been almost impossible for the last 4 years. So you have Lena Khan, essentially running the FTC. In my opinion, one of the worst federally elected officials in the history of America.
Wow.
I studied industry and regulation undergrad and wrote my thesis with a gentleman that had really written the federal merger guidelines. And the reality is that very few markets are going to have anti-competitive effects. So if Delta wanted to buy American Airlines, that would be very bad for consumers because you have an industry there that has natural monopoly, huge barriers to entry. Delta and American or Delta and United compete directly on many routes. So three sort of scaled players, maybe 5 with JetBlue and Southwest, 3 or 5 becoming 2 or 3 really, really bad. But there's so many markets where the government has intervened in M&A of late that make no sense because, consumer pricing is hardly likely to move at all. And there's this analysis, which is kind of the relative market share in the industry as defined. What's the relevant industry? So if you think about it, if you sell ice cream cones on West 4th Street and you have another vendor on West 5th Street, those are reasonably, competitive. But an ice cream vendor on our street and some ice cream vendor in Brooklyn, nobody's deciding whether to get an ice cream cone here or in Brooklyn. Yeah. I think with the what her team and department have done a lot lately have blocked mergers between people selling ice cream cones in Brooklyn and people selling them, in the Village, almost out of a sense of just all mergers are per se anti-competitive. And the reality is a lot of the venture capital industry derives a lot of its returns from strategic M&A. And particularly in software where there's virtually no barrier to entry and anybody can start a new player in a SaaS space and there's very little natural monopoly. To think that sort of any merger activity in software should be rejected, I think is kind of crazy. And we certainly saw with Adobe and Figma deal being held up for so long. That was a bad thing for the venture industry. And I also think a SEC that is far more focused on IPOs being able to happen and happen more seamlessly. Look, the reality is obviously there's a huge backlog of companies that are private that should be public right now.
Yeah.
There are many reasons for that. Among them are the SEC rules. And I would hope, and we know, look, the current SEC guidelines largely came out of Enron in the, mid 2000s. And a lot of what the SEC does is really positive for investors. But at the same time, I think the SEC policies, particularly as relates to investing in private funds, have some very some effects that are very much unintended consequences. So a lot of the best returns available in private markets come from, or a lot of the best returns in financial markets come from investing in private markets. Sophisticated investors, endowments, high net worth can invest in certain asset classes. Your average person on the street cannot. Of course, it is far better to not have people losing all of their money, but you can lose all of your money in the stock market, right? And so I don't think there's a huge difference between letting individuals that don't meet whatever kind of net worth or income standard invest in private companies. It's almost systematically unfair to derive that and very kind of paternalistic.
Last year we talked about so much. Is the IPO window opening? Is it closing? Do you feel like now that Trump is in office or will be in office soon, the IPO window will open up again?
So, look, I think one of the biggest implications of the election is a M&A antitrust framework that probably is more conducive to allowing tech companies to get acquired. Certainly, I think we saw with Adobe and Figma and a lot of other cases that mergers are being blocked right now for undoubtedly well-intentioned reasons on the government side that are making it very difficult for companies that have scaled that would potentially combine with other companies in their space have no downstream impact on consumer prices. Those companies are really struggling to get to exits, and I think it's a really good thing for our industry to have kind of strategic M&A come back.
Early stage startups, though, like we see M&A and IPOs, but for an early stage startup, how are those affected by the election, if any?
Yeah, I wouldn't think the election has too much impact on early stage startups. Look, at the end of the day, great companies are founded in all market environments. The most important judge of whether a early stage startup is going to scale well is whether it finds product market fit, whether it's systematically creating value for its customers. I tend to think I get a lot of questions from reporters. What do you think about this interest rate change or this, geopolitical development? Surely, if you are a business that has a direct, implication from interest rates or the war in Ukraine, critical. Yeah. But the reality is the average sort of domestic business serving domestic customers can do that in any market environment. So I don't think it'll have too much impact for better or for worse.